Well, I was able to get a retaining ring spanner on here that would actually move that. It wasn't easy, but it's actually starting to move. So that's good. Having broken it loose, I can use a different spanner on there now and shift that. But they're exceptionally difficult to get loose. All the other cameras are quite easy by comparison. These ones are just wicked there. Yeah, that's moving now. I can push that round with the tip of my tweezers. I couldn't do anything with it to start off with. You can see from the scuff marks on the top that it didn't go without a fight. I'll find another spanner. Right, I can use this spanner now to get that loose, I think. Yeah, that's working nicely now. It was just breaking it loose was the hard part. A spanner of this sort probably wouldn't do the job because it's not robust enough. It would distort and pop out of the slots pretty promptly. Yeah. So there's the retaining ring. You can see it's quite short. But you can possibly see it goes right down into a recess here. And it's that recess, that's the friction from that recess that causes all the problems. Okay, taking this apart from the back. Got 3 screws here. Four, sorry. Oh, that was clever. Let's lift this off. Okay. So there effectively is the other half of our focus mount. I'll pop that to one side for cleaning. And here's the shutter itself. You've already pulled off the retaining ring, so it means we'll be able to lift the shutter out of that housing. This is the cocking piece here. Is that the cocking one? Or the release? Yeah, that's the cocking one. Okay, to the front of the shutter. How many screws? 3 chrome screws here now. Try not to slip off and scar those screws. They're quite small. They'll be chromed brass. You could make a mess of the screws, or you could make a mess of the housing around the screws if you slip off. This is all satin chrome here, and satin chrome is a bit unforgiving. Right, so we should be able to wriggle this to bits. Lift that up. Lift that front ring off. That's it. That comes off. That comes off. Okay. These 2 rings come off. This is all quite dirty and sticky. This front piece here comes off. Now there's a couple of ways of dealing with that. You can remove, if you wanted access to the front of the shutter, you can get in this way. There are 4 small screws. And they hold this lens mount to the front of the shutter. There's a little locating pin here that's holding me up. Let's see if we can get that lifted out. There we go. That's our lens mount. There's a little baffle here, or cover plate really. It doesn't really, just covers the front of the shutter. Now to get deeper into the shutter, you'd need to remove this outer piece. There are 4 screws from memory around the outside here. You can remove this piece complete with that lens mount that I removed from the front. You can remove these pieces together in one piece if you so desire. Alright, so there's the casing with the 4 screws, and here's our shutter. Well, our shutter's loose because I've already loosened the retaining ring, so we can get this off probably. It's a bit of a wriggle getting it off over the lever there. You can see this is quite dirty. A lot of that's just dirt. It's the blackness is probably graphite of some sort, possibly graphite grease. Now there are springs here at the back. Now the springs are used to bring the aperture blades to the, close them down when you fire the shutter, because you're viewing at full aperture. They need to close down to the set aperture when you fire the shutter. And the other one is for the shutter. It closes the shutter blades before everything happens. So you're viewing with the shutter wide open. And the shutter blades have to close before the reflex mirror and capping plate swing out of the way. And then the shutter opens and closes to make the exposure. And then the basically it sits there with the shutter blades closed again, and when you cock the shutter for the next exposure, the capping plate has to close the aperture at the back of the camera, the reflex mirror has to swing down, and the shutter has to open for viewing. The aperture has to open to full aperture for viewing. Now we'll see if we can get this retaining ring off the front. Let's get it in a position I can get under it. There we go. This is the shutter proper, if you like. Here's the shutter speed settings cam plate. Here's the lock that holds the shutter in the cocked position. This is like the internal, it's not really the cocking ring, but it in this shutter. Now this shaft is a bit stiff to come out. It may mean it's slightly distorted. It's probably not going to cause a problem. I'm unhooking the main spring. This is the main spring that drives the shutter. Now this one is like a new one just about. If we take this tab as being at 12 o'clock, this one here is at about 2 o'clock. That's like, looks like a new spring. That's what they're supposed to look like. Normally they're tired and that's well down. That's interesting to see. It means that the shutter has been serviced at some stage and someone's replaced the spring, or it means the shutter's done very little work, which probably means the camera's done very little work, of course. But that's good to see. It means that the shutter will, when it's serviced, will work very well. I'll remove the screw here from the delay action or self timer, and we'll lift that out of the casing. There are 2 screws hold the retard gear train in position. That's very tight. Here's our retard gear train. This is the latch that holds the main drive cam in the cocked position. And that's its return spring I just unhooked there. Underneath this is the flash sink mechanism. The X and M flash sink, there's their flash contact. Just remove that component. I need to unhook this spring, so I need a better pair of pliers for that, because although I've got half a dozen pairs of pliers here, I've never got the right ones. Well, this one will do, will make do. So I'll just put a screwdriver behind here to stop that lever moving back. Stretch that spring out with my pliers, unhook it. That lever should lift off. The pallet wheel should lift off. Now I need a screwdriver here. There's a screw here. It's got a post in the centre, so I need a screwdriver that's been relieved in the centre so that it'll fit over that post. Now I do have such things. In fact, I've got two that could do this job. One of them's gone AWOL, but the other one I think I can find. Unless they were both taken away to do the same job and were never returned. I'll have to hunt back later. Well, I found one of the two missing screwdrivers, and one is fortunately all we need. But I will make a replacement for the missing one, I think, in fullness of time. I have in mind I took it to do some unrelated task where I needed a similar screwdriver, and I probably neatly packed it away with the tools that I'd otherwise used on that job, but I can't remember what the job was. And so I don't know where the tools would have been put, or even what other tools I was using at the time. Okay. That's looking pretty good. Stripped everything out from the inside of the shutter that I need. Stripped out at the moment. All the springs and so forth have been removed. At the back, this is the control lever for our diaphragm, the aperture. One of the three screws is a post that the spring hooks around. Going to make sure that goes back in the right place. You can make a sketch of where it goes, or you can scratch your head and figure it out later, whichever suits you. Take that lever off. This is the lever for setting the X and M flash sink and the self timer. It lifts straight off. This is the inner shutter housing, and three screws here hold the mechanism plate into the shutter housing. Pop those to one side. Right, so if I lift the casing off, here we have our mechanism plate and the shutter blades, and they're sitting on this plate. Now that plate allows you to open and close the shutter independent to the normal shutter action. Here we have the diaphragm for our aperture settings, and this all needs to be completely free from oil and be very free running, so that when you release the shutter, this slams down to the closed position, and there's something sticky about that action. It certainly is. That action's not as smooth as it should be. So I've got to clean all that. It may be that the moving plate here is sticky. It may maybe have a little bit of grease or something on there making that stick, or a bit of dirt in there. It gets to this stage and it doesn't really want to move past there, not easily, because the spring tension is to close it, but it doesn't want to open past that point. There's something odd there. Oh well, no doubt all questions will be answered once I get this thing apart. Just check everything is as it should be there. 3 screws hold the retainer plate in place. All 3 screws are countersunk head screws, and they're all the same length as far as I remember. They're quite small. Be careful not to lose them, they'd be easily lost. Now I've undone 3 of them and I can see 2 of them. Where's the third? There's the third. If we tip this out, here we've got the shutter case, which needs to be scrupulously clean. At the moment you can see there's a lot of dirty black stuff around there. That's probably graphite grease. It probably doesn't need to be as prominent as that. Here's the moving ring, and here are our blades, 5 blades, and here's the retaining ring. Now if you look at that retaining ring, you can see it's quite marked. That's corrosion. They're fingerprints. What it means is that someone's grabbed it between finger and thumb, and their perspiration and skin oils have just etched into that surface and left it rough. So I probably want to polish that because I want it to be smooth. These blades need to move very freely. Now I said that these blades, one of them was particularly didn't want to open fully. This blade's damaged. The edge of this blade here is folded down. I'm not sure at the moment how that was done. But that blade is damaged. I'm going to look at its mates and see if it's just one blade. If it's just one blade, and it appears to be, it may be that the blade was damaged when the shutter was assembled. If a blade comes out of position while you're busy getting everything into position, if one of the pivots is not correctly aligned with one of the holes and you tighten up the screws on the retainer plate, you can damage blades, and it may be that that's what's caused that damage. But certainly that blade there is damaged. That edge is folded down. Now it may well be that I can straighten that out and that blade will function completely normally after that. But I don't know that at this point. It may well be that I'm going to have to check through my parts, find a shutter for one of this model and get the blade from it to replace that. You know, certainly that would certainly explain why that diaphragm was stiff, because there wasn't any other obvious explanation, and that would most certainly be an obvious explanation. So these parts all need to be scrupulously cleaned. I'll start with the case and the diaphragm because that's where I always start, and then I'll move on to the mechanism plate because that's what I typically do next. And once the mechanism plate's clean and the shutter blades are all clean, I can reassemble the mechanism plate to the case and then assemble the components to the top of the shutter. Well, I'll clean everything in the usual way with some naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, and cotton buds, Q-tips. and just swab all the surfaces to get everything clean. Need to remove all traces of the old grease, because the old grease, a lot of it is not in places where it was ever doing anything useful, and even if it was, it's probably dried out. The grease has usually gone hard and sticky with age, and acts more as a retardant than a friction reducer. So this case all needs to be cleaned inside and out. Outside here particularly too, because this is where the control levers for the aperture and the shutter closing action run, and as a result they need to be clean and friction free so that the aperture, the diaphragm, closes down to the set aperture as soon as the shutter is released, and that the shutter blades of course close down fully prior to the mirror and everything swinging up out of the way before they open to make the exposure. So this camera is turning out to be a little bit interesting. From the outside it looked to have an interesting problem with the film release, but beyond that I wasn't really expecting any complications, and it appears that it's got the wrong exposure meter in it, and it appears that the shutter was damaged either during original assembly or during servicing. This type of shutter typically needed to be serviced at least once a decade in order to be reliable, and we've had about 6 decades since this camera was built. The fact that the main spring was in such wonderful condition suggests to me that the shutter had been serviced at some stage in recent historical times. And so, in typical fashion, the last person to service something is the person that gets blamed for all the problems. Whether that's fair or not is a different matter, but that's just how it works. If you were the last one to touch it, it must be your fault. It was perfectly fine till you did this or that or the other thing. So I'm just wiping this to make sure I'm free. You can see all the oil and stuff coming off that. That should have all been clean, of course. And I'm going to polish this to get rid of all those marks. I can feel, as I rub the cotton bud across there, you can feel roughness where those patches of corrosion are. So it means there's just more friction there than there otherwise would be. That the blades won't skim over them as freely as they should. So that'll have to be polished with a bit of Brasso. Let's have a look at the moving plate. I was blaming this for the stiffness. I thought that the grease on the edge of this moving plate was possibly causing the stiffness, but the stiffness was clearly being, or I believe, was being caused by that damaged blade. And the cause of that damaged blade, I'm yet to determine. It may have been something simple, like the blade not being correctly in position when the retainer plate was tightened down. Or it may be something more complex than that, like a screw being passed through the plate, through one of the plates that was not the correct screw and stuck through further than it should have done. I just don't know. Perhaps I can figure that one out, or it might just be a mystery for all time. And the video camera is letting me know that my battery is just about flat again. Well, it's time to have a close look at this blade. See if I can push it back into shape where that edge is crimped down. I could do with a few smaller holes in this bench block. I'm just going to try rolling that down with the heel of my tweezers. See if it forces that edge down smoothly. It's improved, but it's not as good as I'd like. Let's try it from this side. The steel that these blades is made from is quite springy, so when it's been forced into taking a set where something's been bent on it, it's reluctant to straighten back out. That's not the way it behaves. Well, that looks a lot better. I'm inclined to think that'll work well. I'm just going to give that a clean now with some naphtha. I've cleaned the other blades, but I'll give this one a clean and I'll see what it looks like. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to tell exactly what you've achieved of anything until everything is clean. We'll know when I reassemble the diaphragm whether it's moved smoothly or not. I'll just hold that up to the light. Now, it's not flat. I don't think that's going to be good enough. I'll try bending it up. I'm holding it up to the light, so I'm out of your view, sorry, but it's greatly improved over what it was. I'm just not sure that it's good enough. Such a tiny edge of the blade that's bent. I think all I can do is assemble the diaphragm and see how it behaves. And I'm now going to do a more thorough job of cleaning that because I can see a fingerprint on that when I was handling it. Okay, well I think assembling the diaphragm would be the order of the day. I better find the jig.